Today on The State of Us, rural America is growing fast, but will it last? Violent crime is on the rise. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson. The pandemic and the work-from-home movement sparked an economic resurgence in sparsely populated areas as workers fled big cities. That's according to an article in the Wall Street Journal. And we're also looking at a piece from the Wall Street Journal that tells us murder rates didn't soar only in cities during the pandemic. Small town sheriffs and prosecutors are overwhelmed with cases. So rural America is doing good in some respects. It's booming, it's growing. But in other respects, there's some challenges still going on as well. So we're going to look at all that and more today. But before we fully dive in, Lance, do we have a word of the day?
We do. What is the good and bad within the hearth of America? Hearth, one syllable. Justin's got a chance. It is a noun. The good and bad in the hearth. Second definition, the fireside as the center of family life, and the family life and home. So we have many people coming from the cities to establish their hearth in rural America, and while it has its advantages, it also has some disadvantages, which seems to, at least by the people in charge in rural America, to have led to a major increase in violence. Because one of the things about living in the country, or in what the articles call rural America, what my oldest daughter's boyfriend calls it, God's country, as he gets off the freeway to come see us. Here in God's country, it tends to be a little bit, lonely at times. Some of us like, I would say, solitude. Some of us like the solitude, but during the pandemic, that can also lead to, as the article points out, some increase in drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and mental health issues, which seems to maybe to have led to an increase in violence, because some, I don't know why they live here if they don't like all the solitude. I myself love the solitude of my hearth.
The Wall Street Journal tells us that small communities have long lagged far behind big cities in job creation and income growth. But since the pandemic, many are seeing an infusion of remote workers drawn by lower costs, laid-back lifestyles, and natural beauty, and worn down by crime and other urban challenges. Their presence has helped spur hiring, income gains, and home price growth in rural towns. So when we look at some measures of rural resurgence, more people moved to rural counties during the pandemic, spurring employer demand for workers and faster income gains. How do we know that? Well, if we look at the net domestic migration per 1,000 residents, it fell by over 10 for large central metro counties, and it grew by 5 or a little more for rural counties. And that's from 2011 through 2021. And then if we look at job postings, the percentage change from February of 2020 to the most recent data in 2022. So everything starts at 0, right? Because we're talking percentage change from February of 2020. The job postings have come back to just ever so slightly, like maybe 1% higher than they were in February of 2020 for large metro counties. While in rural counties, it's sitting closer to 5 or 8%. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 7% percentage points greater. And then lastly, the personal income per capita. So the percentage change from a year earlier, as measured from 2015 through 2020, the personal income per capita. So how much is each person making, that percentage change on average? Well, from 2015 through 2020, In 2015, it was about 2% for rural counties and a little over 4% for large metro areas. But in 2020, rural counties take the lead at almost 8%, while large metro counties are at 6%. So in all of these measures, net domestic migration, number of job postings, and the personal income per capita, they are all higher in rural areas than they are urban areas. And as the article pointed out, that's very unusual, right? That is the opposite of what most people think of when they think of rural areas.
It seems to me, though, that the driving force would be remote work, that these people that are many of the people. Now, some people are leaving the city just because, yeah, the lifestyle's fun, but do we really want to be here? And wow, you go out here and you can buy house and land cheaper than you can live in a 2-bedroom flat or apartment in New York City or Boston. So why not live, in the hinterland of Vermont or Connecticut, and I can buy a big spread and it's quiet and it's nice to raise a family. But to be able to do that, you have to be able to make money. And so working remotely allows them who, that $100,000, $150,000 they might be making in an office in the major metropolitan area goes a long way out here in rural America. And as far as buying a home and living styles and arrangements and things like that. And when you talk about, Amazon and those kind of places where you can get on your phone and computer and order something and have it there the next day, why do you have to live in the big city where you can do the same thing, just walking out of your apartment and go down 2 stores and there, is the product that you want. You can order it now and have it next day or same day in many cases. So, but then that means that money is leaving the city and coming to the rural area where most people don't make that kind of money. So it would raise the average. You understand what I'm saying? But then also there's more money being spent in the rural area because these people come to the rural areas with money. And so they're looking for that good sandwich or that fancy drink or that place to hang out while they're working remotely. And so small businesses in these rural areas see an influx in patrons, and that too then increases the money that they make. So that's the way I would explain the rise in income as well as population, the reasons why and why it would happen in rural America at a greater rate. It's not really that the normal citizen in rural America is making more money, but the people moving into rural America are making enough money that it's raising that average.
Well, when you also think about the types of jobs available, especially pre-pandemic, right? When we look at rural communities, a lot more of the jobs being done in rural communities require a person to be physically present to do a job, right? Think of things like manufacturing. You can't really do that remotely. You have to show up to do the job, right? Now, when we think about big metro areas, a huge portion of all the jobs in large metropolitan areas are what? Well, they're office jobs, right? They are the jobs that in many cases can be done either exclusively or at least partially remotely. So that makes big, dense cities much more susceptible to losing workers as a result of remote work initially, because small towns aren't super susceptible to that because they don't have a lot of corporate headquarters with a lot of white collar jobs in them traditionally. So they're a place that people are likely to leave the big city to go to. And the big city is sitting there saying, well, we don't have to have all these people in person. So while, yes, there are those benefits to Lance's point, I think what we're also seeing, and one of the reasons this article is of interest is especially in our small town and some of the neighboring communities. For those that don't know, we're in rural Ohio, but we are situated, our community specifically, about 45 minutes from the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, and Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio, obviously one of the largest cities in Ohio, and the capital. So there are, millions and millions of people within a 45-minute drive of where we are, but we're in a rural area.
And also the crossroads of America of Interstate 70 and Interstate 75.
Yes.
Which, if you don't know, I-70 runs east to west across the majority of the United States, and I-75 runs from Miami to Canada. So you're talking about we're 35 minutes from where those two interstate highways intersect in the United States. And so there are lots of trucking and shipping jobs, and also then factories around that, because places have built their headquarters there because it's very easy then for them. Then there have been multiple on and off ramps built and widened and improved in the last 10 or 15 years, because places like Amazon and UPS and FedEx have moved to this region because the on and off accessibility to I-70 and I-75 allows them to then ship goods by truck, by semi, anywhere in the United States, because those roads will get them to any place else, basically in America, north and south, east and west. So we live in a hub of a lot of those kinds of jobs as well.
And so if you work for one of those companies, we're in a unique position, because if you need to physically be present, that's an option, right? But you could also live remotely, or you could also work remotely, but still have access to a lot of those amenities. And for what it's worth, while my husband does not work remotely, it's a good example of we're close enough that he has worked in both Columbus and Dayton, and commuted regularly every day, because that's feasible. It's doable.
And kept your hearth and home here in rural America.
Correct. But it wasn't always that way. We lived in downtown Cincinnati, for a time in an apartment. So we certainly did that and are familiar with it. It is very different though. And I think that, so part of what we're seeing that's very interesting in our town and other towns nearby is a lot of those things Lance has talked about. We're seeing some of these new places as those types of people move in and say, these are things that we want. The other thing I think that we're finding is that you don't need, 20 different options for coffee. You need 3 or 4 good options for coffee, and small towns can provide that. The other thing is that I think, in this age of scale, right, and chains and brands that are national, one thing that I think is a hard and challenging thing to measure, but I believe anecdotally is very true, is when you read this article and you hear about some of the reasons that people like living in the rural communities, is partly because, like, for example, we have a coffee shop called The Depot, right, in Urbana. There is one of those, one and only one in the entire world. And it's here in Urbana. So is there other places you can get coffee? Sure there are. We have, like Tim Hortons, for example, which is a chain. We're about to get a Dunkin' Donuts, which is a chain. Like, people, you've probably heard of those. You've probably never heard of the Depot, and you probably never would, because it's never going to be a national chain with 50,000 locations. That's just not going to happen. So, but in some ways there is an allure to that, right? It is in a building that is unique to it. It is in a place that you can only find here. And there is something to be said for people liking that sort of novelty, right? So we're going to keep talking about some of the statistics that tell us what's going on that's good in rural America. But importantly, in the next segment, we're also going to look at the increase in violent crime in rural America and how that might pose a challenge. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Remote work was a greater driver of worker relocation during the pandemic than the risk of COVID-19 or government restrictions. That's based on an analysis that was performed by a finance professor at Vanderbilt University. He looked at a bunch of survey data from a moving company and found out that the main reason, the primary driver for people relocating, the greatest single factor, was the availability of remote work.
But which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Well, sure.
Because
the remote work happened because not necessarily because of the accelerated
pandemic, but yes, it grew immensely. And the pandemic, the disease, was spread by close contact with other individuals. And one thing that you can gain by being out here in God's country is that you don't have to be on top of one another. But even then, there were more people living in your apartment building than there are on the 1 mile stretch of street that you live on now.
Right. Yeah.
And it's spread out, so much more instead of just straight up. And so when you're talking about a disease like COVID, which spreads because people come in contact with others breathing, I can live an entire week without coming within 15 feet of another human being.
Right. Easily. And
I get my groceries delivered and buy anything I want.
Well, and you can get outside.
I've got room where I can walk and not have to go to the park or wear a mask and worry about running into someone else. I have a piece of property that I can walk around 3 times and it's a mile and it's my property and nobody else is allowed to be on it. So I might come in contact with a deer or a gopher, or I got a bunch of squirrels that, eat the walnuts dropping from my trees in the fall. But that's about all I run into. And I can walk by my creek and, kind of sounds a little idyllic, and it is, right? It's kind of, Walt Whitman and those guys, those famous poets of the 1800s. But you have those opportunities, and then, and I also don't have to go to work. And wait a minute, when I come out here, you can buy my house and my property probably more cheaply than you can buy a condo in New York City. A 1-bedroom condo, an efficiency apartment, you can buy my whole house and property for the same price that you can buy one of those in the city. Of course it looks attractive.
Well, and another thing that's sort of we have science to support it, but it's also anecdotal in that, people may not be able to pinpoint it as a conscious thing that they understand about the benefits of it. But we talk about, when you're in a city, and I think about like where I lived in Cincinnati. And I mean, Lance is right. Cincinnati's whatever, the 23rd largest metro in the country or something. But the difference between the 23rd largest and the first largest are, astronomical. At the same time, the difference between Cincinnati and Urbana is also astronomical. So there's a lot of big steps and very different. But I think about like where I lived in downtown Cincinnati and the most nature that I could get to, quickly. Well, number one, from my window in my apartment, you could not see grass or trees. There was no grass or trees to be seen. There were buildings, there were sidewalks, you could see the outside, but it was concrete and steel and glass.
The concrete jungle.
And that's what you could see, you know. Now, on the opposite side of our building, there was a nice little, boulevard that had some trees in the middle and some planters and places to sit, but nothing at all compared to what I see just on my 6-minute commute from my house to the studio where we are right now.
Or standing in your kitchen, having a cup of coffee and looking out your back window.
Just at the lawn, window. Right. Because there's grass out there and trees, Yeah, I live in a subdivision, but even if you live in a suburb, there's those things that you may not have. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with anything? But the science is backed up by the American Psychological Association, the APA, and they found out that, most Americans are clocking in more than 10 hours a day in front of a screen, which increases reliance on technology. Combining it with a global trend toward urban living, generally speaking, over the last decade, means many people are spending less time outdoors. And science is telling us that's bad. It is bad for our health. And you might say, in what ways? Well, in 2019, the University of Chicago looked at a report and found, for instance, that green spaces near schools actually promote cognitive development in children, and green views near children's homes promote self-control behaviors. Adults that were assigned to public housing units in neighborhoods with more green space showed better attentional functioning than those assigned to units with less access to natural environments. And experiments have found consistently that being exposed to natural environment improves working memory, cognitive flexibility, and attention control, while exposure to urban environments is linked to attention deficits. So there is a real, again, whether or not you or I or anybody else can consciously communicate that, there is a real drain that occurs physically on people's minds the more time they spend away from nature and the harder it is to access nature. The more readily available it is, the more time they spend in it, the better their attention is, the lower their stress levels are, the easier it is to remember things and process things. All of those are known benefits. And so while you or I may not articulate that, it's that it contributes to that sense of a place that I want my hearth to be, right? Because I don't know why, right? I maybe can't tell you exactly why, but it's that coffee shop that I can't find anywhere else. It's on my way to the coffee shop. I'm going to pass more nature than I could see in, a mile block of a big city. And those things, again, are small, but they're not in terms of scientifically what we know about what those do to create that sense of contentment, right? Which is what we all want. And especially during the pandemic, when that sense of contentment, if you lived in a city, was upended even more aggressively than it was for people in rural areas, you're really searching to find that again. And then you pull yourself out of that and you experience this other option. And it's like, wow, it's even more of a relief because you were so deprived of that. The pandemic exacerbates that, right? And says, like, if I was still living in that apartment I was in, where am I going? I mean, I'm locked inside in a 500 square foot space anytime that I'm not at work. And I'm not at work because the office is shut down. So I'm just in that space all the time. I can see no nature from my window, right? A lot of the places that I would go, which are chain places, are all shut down. So I think all of that plays together in a way that's very hard to just put raw data to. But I think, some of the science explains well, Lance, those benefits.
But at the same time, we saw a rise in violent crimes like we have not seen in decades. And so why is that? Now, I might kind of surmise here that, I had to spend so much time in the family room in front of the hearth with my family that I didn't get out. The areas that you're talking about didn't open. And because the work that my family did required us to be in person and we weren't allowed to be in person, then I had much more money troubles because I couldn't continue to make the money I was making before. And then I had to live with people and never got to get out because the local stores were closed as well because there was fear of intermingling with one another because of this pandemic, which then caused mental issues to rise, which then caused violent crimes to incur. I don't know. Is that a leap? But at the same time, we just got done describing this idyllic living arrangement that we have out here in rural America. Yet at the same time, our second article today talks about the historic increase in violent crimes in the last 20 years, and in particular, during the years of the pandemic. So what's the connection, or is there not one? It just happened.
To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. The Wall Street Journal reports that violent crime isn't just rising in the nation's cities. Murder rates across the rural U.S. have soared during the pandemic, data show, bringing the kind of extreme violence long associated with major metropolitan areas to America's smallest communities. Homicide rates in rural America rose 25% in 2020, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It was the largest rural increase since the agency began tracking such data in 1999. The CDC considers counties rural if they are located outside metropolitan areas defined by the federal government. The rise came close to the 30% spike in homicide rates in metropolitan areas in 2020. And the CDC has not yet analyzed the data for 2021. The thing here, I guess, that's worth pointing out is, number one, this is a historic rise in violent crime in rural America. One of the reasons, in fact, cited by the original article that we were discussing about why people might want to move to rural America is because there is a lower crime rate, generally speaking, and a less violent crime rate, generally speaking, than there are in large metro areas. That's still true. Okay, well, this data tells us that's still true. However, it also tells us that the percentage increase was not far off from the percentage increase in metropolitan areas as well. So on the whole, are you still safer living in rural America, less likely to be a victim of violent crime? Yes. However, it has increased greatly, and the pandemic certainly contributed to that. So it was a 25% rise in homicide rates in rural areas in the country versus a 30% rise in non-rural areas. In cities, law enforcement and civic leaders have blamed the increase in violent crime on factors such as police pulling back after racial justice protests, the proliferation of guns, initiatives to release more criminal suspects without bail, and a pandemic pause in gang violence prevention programs. Now, it's important here, this notes, Lance, right? This is what law enforcement and civic leaders are saying they think is the reason for it. So we don't actually know that these things are the reason.
Yeah, so that explains the cities, right? But what explains these smaller areas, these rural areas that are mentioned in this article, and places of the backwoods of Arkansas and the open west of Montana and the southern regions of, South Carolina, which have seen the increase, which they don't have all of this. Yeah, I say this. Is there gang activity? Yes. Are there drugs in these small areas? And yes, it's one of the major problems we have in rural America, but not to the extent that it is typically in the city. So what's causing it, or what do we think is causing it in these rural areas? Well, many of it, we see an increase, as we've seen across the board. And this seems to be, we've said it about schools, we've said it everywhere, the rise in mental health problems, that the pandemic has caused people either to, lose their jobs, economically not see a way out, or psychologically not being able to see people or interact the way they normally do. And that then has increased anxiety levels, which then in some way, and Justin, maybe you can lend credence to it, the rise in acting out violently because you don't have the normal human interaction. You don't see a way out economically. You have to, while you may love your family, you're used to going to work 8 to 10 hours a day. And in the pandemic, now you're seeing them 24/7, and you just can't get away from each other. And that causes, tempers to flare, that leads to violent crimes because you're watching your children go hungry because you can't work to provide for them the way you could before. All of those things then are possible triggers that would cause some of this violent crime, and some of it in towns where neighbors know each other and they end up shooting each other, over perceived slights like taking care of your lawn, anecdotally in the story. I mean, seems a little far-fetched, but yet we read about it in this article.
Well, an American Farm Bureau Federation poll taken in December of 2020 found that 2/3 of adults in rural America, you heard that right, 2/3 of adults in rural America between the ages of 18 and 44 said they experienced more mental health challenges than in the prior year. And according to a CDC survey conducted in June of 2020, 12% of responding adults in rural areas reported starting or increasing their use of drugs or alcohol to cope with pandemic-related stresses. So it's not only the mental health challenges, but then it's also the consumption of mind-altering substances that are not prescription, right, to cope and or to attempt to deal with this, which, as we know, those things, you don't deal with it. It's an escape more than it is a means to actually address the problem.
And many of those are depressants.
Yes.
The chemicals, they depress you even more.
Right.
You use them to escape. And when you come out of it, you are more depressed than you were before, which then maybe causes you to lash out when you wouldn't otherwise, because you have mental problems, you escape, you come back, and your problems seem worse than they were before because of what you've chosen to escape with.
Yeah. And the other issue is that, there's in these areas, they're large geographic areas. So when these things do happen, there are less deputies available, for the total size area. They often have to travel, quite a long ways in order to get things done. There's less of them, and they have less experience investigating this kind of stuff because they just don't, there's not as many of them to investigate.
Well, and less money, less funding. The article also points out that it's more difficult to connect them the way that they are typically connected in larger cities. For example, they're not usually part of like an organized crime group, like a gang or something like that. It's usually, like Lance said, somebody got, mad or upset or snapped and then took it out on somebody else. But it's not like it was part of a conspiracy or a conflict, or it was primarily mental health related, which is much harder to target than it is groups of connected incidents or a person or people, right, who are going out and doing this. It's a one person who doesn't have a history of being, violent and then struggling with these problems and it being unknown to people and then it coming to a head and resulting in this. So they're harder to investigate. There's less money available, and the challenges of implementing prevention programs are challenging for law enforcement because a lot of times they're not connected through things that law enforcement addresses, like, for example, mental health. But all in all, the numbers show it's still safer here in rural America than it is in the major metropolitan areas.
It's just less safe than it used to be.
Because obviously, as you like to point out, you can make numbers say a lot of things. So an increase of, okay, we only have one, then we have three. That's a triple the growth, right? Of violent crimes.
It tripled.
The violent crime tripled in the county, and it went from 1 to 3.
But if you went from 1,000 to 1,500 in a city,
right?
Well, that's, we only increased it by
50% or whatever, right?
So
we're doing better,
right.
But
yeah, it tripled here.
Right.
It went from 1 to 3, but over here it only increased 50%. And so it's like we saw a 300% increase, or we saw a 50% increase. Well, the 300% increase has to be worse. Well, it's relative.
2 people versus 500,
right?
So,
which isn't to say that it's not bad. Like, a 25% increase in homicide is obviously is bad, but it is also relative to understanding that they are comparing a percent increase. So there were
raw numbers,
right? Not raw numbers. So there is an important distinction there. The last question sort of posed, Lance, was we take all this in, right? And will it last? Rural America growing fast. The thing, I guess, that I would say is, will it last growing as fast as it currently is? Maybe not. I think, though, with the increase of remote work, the flexibility of where people can live, and the key, and the article points this out, by the way, is that the largest growth was outsizably in communities within 100 miles of a major metropolitan area. Okay. So when you get further away than 100 miles from a major metro,
people still want to stay close.
The data changes.
Is that what you're saying? People still want their symphonies, their ball games, the things that the major metropolitan areas will offer that you don't get in the rural environment.
They want it all. Or we are playing with access to it all, right? I am not so far away that if I want to go to a place that's not available in my town, I can get there. It's not an uncomfortable thing to go do, right? I can drive 45 minutes. I can go to the outlet mall. I can whatever.
Like we can see.
I can go to the ball game.
Right. We can see a major musical, a concert, a professional sports activity, a symphony, major works of art going through an art museum. You and I are within 45 minutes to an hour to your 2 hour of 6 places.
Right.
I mean, we can be in Detroit, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Columbus. There's 5, right?
Yeah.
Within a couple of hours.
Yep.
Yet we can live in rural America and be able to know our neighbors, develop friendships with people, be able to walk in the grocery store and go to the same clerk every time to check us out. Yeah, we still have that here. You don't have to always do self-checkout like you do.
It's coming though.
It is close.
Lance is.
It is close.
He's getting anxious.
It is close. Well, so then you can order your groceries online here in small town, and the person who brings your groceries out typically is the same person if you get it on the same day because they
Yes.
So at least, but you can make those connections in a small town, yet we still have the advantages. Or if you want to go out to dinner, right? You can go out to while we do have our local places that serve nice dinners but every once in a while you want to go, to that chain or where you went when you were in college or whatever. We still have those opportunities. So we get to eat our cake and, we get to have our cake and eat it too, right?
Well, that's the thinking. The question of the sustainability of it is the challenge. But I think Lance and I have been advocating for years. And if you're a longtime listener of the show, the biggest thing is making sure that the infrastructure is there to support these types of opportunities in rural communities, keeping them well connected. We're not just talking about internet, but making sure the roads, the bridges, the things that connect us to the metro areas, there is a synergy there, right? And I think that is what excites me about hopefully what's being tapped into is how rural and urban communities can work together to provide good lifestyles, healthy lifestyles for people.
Now you don't have to make a choice. You can have both.
At least for now. And hopefully, we figure out how to continue that trend for people because as the data has told us, people are generally happier and not just happier, but healthier, both physically and mentally when they have access to the right combination of items. So why do we have this conversation today, Lance? What were we hoping to accomplish?
Well, first of all, we know that, our listeners are split. We have many in rural America. We have many in metropolitan areas. So tell us what you think. Email us at podcast@thestateofus.org. But the reason for the show, well, we have a mission here at True Chat, and that mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. Hopefully we've done that. As I said, let us know what you think. You're talking in the office or at home or after church or wherever you congregate at the depot or at Dunkin' Donuts or wherever those places are. You can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays, released first thing in the morning as a podcast. Those same episodes are heard on the weekends across the United States on AM and FM radio stations. Lance, who's our winner today on Hearth?
I think I eked it out, but I'll let Bradley decide that after he does all of his editing skills.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think you did. I'm willing to concede that one.
You made an early, you scored early.
Yes.
But then kind of lost steam.
Yep.
And I just kept putting a run on the board every inning. And I think that I outdistanced you there at the end.
For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch. Thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We will see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.